So 2024 was a fantastic reading year for me. I ended up reading about 80 books that I would consider to put in a list like this. There was some nonfiction, some other things that I read, but I took about 80 books and went over them all, and I came up with my top 10 for the year. I have a few honorable mentions that I want to get to first. I read quite a few Clifford D. Simic books this year, and I really wanted one of those to be on the list. But my favorite was Project Pope. It was really good. It was written a little bit later in Simic's career. There was a lot of ideas thrown out in this one, a lot of reoccurring themes that I've started picking up on in some of his other novels. It was done really well, but it just didn't quite make the top 10. Now, there was probably a three-way tie for the last spot. I really enjoyed Ian M. Banks' Player of Games, and this is set in the Culture series by Banks. I really want to read more in the Culture series and other works by Banks. And also R.C. Sheriff, the Hopkins manuscript. This was a really early post-apocalyptic book. It was written in 1939. R.C. Sheriff is a fantastic author. He didn't write that much, but what we got was great. This is a really great book, and I could definitely recommend both of these. Like I said, they were kind of a tie for the number 10 slot, but these didn't fit on my board of judgment, so they had to become honorable mentions. Okay, so now let's get to the number 10 spot. On Wings of Song by Thomas M. Disch. This is a very interesting book. This is not one that I'd recommend to everybody. There's a lot of metaphor and symbolism. There's a lot of counterculture themes brought up in this one. It seemed like a book that was deeply personal to Thomas M. Disch. I kind of wish I would have read more of him before I read this, because this is the first book I read from him. I still really enjoyed it. It has a very interesting ending. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I had certain ideas about the ending when I finished this book. But this is a book that stuck with me, and I was looking up some things on Disch afterwards and ended up seeing a video about there's a convention, and they had this little discussion about Thomas M. Disch. And this book was brought up, and some people brought up some other interesting points about the ending that made me see it in a completely different light. And I really want to go back, read more from Disch, and then eventually come back and give that one a reread. And I think I'll like it even more. But still, it made it on the top 10 for the year. At number 9, The Palace of Eternity by Bob Shaw. This is a book that kind of starts off almost like a typical space opera. The plot does involve these ram scoop ships that are scooping up bits of matter through space and using it as fuel. About halfway through the book, somewhere around there, we get some twists and turns, some conceptual breakthroughs, if you will, and the book goes into some completely different directions. I could not recommend this book enough. It's one of those mind-blowing books. It's the first book I've read from Bob Shaw, and I really can't wait to read more from him. At number 8, This Immortal by Roger Zelazny. This was the first book I read from Zelazny. I loved everything about this book. I loved the characters, the villains, the setting, the plot. It is a retelling of some Greek myth, but I was ignorant to all of that. I think even in these retelling stories, if the story's good enough, it should hold its own, and this one definitely did for me. I later read Lord of Light thinking I was going to maybe like that one more, but this is still the favorite from Zelazny for me. At number 7, War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. This is a classic. It probably needs no introduction. I read this when I was younger and I didn't really like it, but after reading so many science fiction books since then, seeing how influential, how ahead of his time he was. This was written in the late 1800s. It has this really great post-apocalyptic setting. He throws so much social commentary into this book, which could be, it was probably very controversial at the time, but just way ahead of itself. I think if anyone wanted to go back and read one of these real early classics, something that predates the golden age of science fiction, this is probably one of the best places to start. There's plenty of other good books from that time period, but this is my favorite of that time. So now at number 6, The Paradox Men by Charles L. Harness. This was a book, I didn't know anything about Charles L. Harness. I'd never heard anyone really talking about this book. And when I read this, I was completely blown away. One of my favorite science fiction authors is Alfred Bester, and that's probably the closest comparison you could put with this book. It did feel a lot like The Demolished Man or The Stars My Destination, but this was actually written before those books. It has tons of ideas thrown out. It has a real interesting concept with time paradoxes, which is how the book gets its name. It does get a little convoluted. It does get hard to follow at times, and it's why I want to reread this one at some point, but it's still done so well, and I really recommend this one to people. Okay, at number 5, First Person Peculiar by T.L. Sherrod. This is a short story collection. Some of the stories are a little bit longer than short stories, maybe into the novelette or novella length, because there's only 4 stories in this collection. And I had done a video earlier in the year about 10 short stories that Barry Malzberg had recommended. And E for Effort was one that he recommended, and it ended up being my favorite out of the 10 that he threw out. And so I had this collection that included 3 others, so I had to go back and read the rest of them. Now there's 2 that are just really good. One is a little silly. One starts to get into some of the ideas that these other 2 have. And then the 2 that I really loved in here were just fantastic. These are not like typical science fiction stories. There's no spaceships, there's no aliens. They were all kind of set in the time period from when they were written, so around the 1950s. They had to deal with ordinary people put into extraordinary situations and how they dealt with authority. They were done so well. He's such a good writer. I wish T.L. Sherrod had written more, but he really only wrote 1 novel and about 6 or 7 short stories. But we got what we got, and I definitely recommend that one if you can find it. Okay, number 4, another short story collection, The Best of Raymond Z. Galoon. Now, Matt at Science Fiction Reads and Richard Rempel over at Vintage SF and I have been reading through these best ofs, and Matt picked this one out thinking, let's just get one out of the way, and we were all completely blown away by this. A lot of these stories were written in the 30s, and then he kind of went through some breaks, and there was some more written in the 50s, and a few even in the 70s, I believe. But they were all so good. The ones in the 30s especially seemed so ahead of their time. He was taking some of the traditional tropes and putting twists on them that is more of what we would think of today with science fiction. And there's just some stories in here that I still think about. If I had to compile a list of my top 10 short fiction and science fiction, I'm sure a couple from this would be on that list. And you don't hear a lot of people talk about Raymond's Galoon, so that's why it's number 4. And at number 3, Gateway by Frederik Pohl. This is a book that I'd been wanting to read for decades, and I'd never really read anything from Frederik Pohl. And just looking at the cover, I thought this is just going to be some ordinary space opera, but it's a lot more than that. There's a lot of psychology put into this book. There's a lot of the plot given away in the beginning, and the narrative structure of this one is fairly unique. And it still manages to, even though there's parts given away, I was captivated through the whole thing, wanting to figure out exactly how it happened. And I couldn't put this book down when I read it. There's also this idea of the Gateway asteroid, which is a alien artifact filled with these spaceships that will take people into unknown parts of the galaxy. It's a gamble because you never know if where you're going to go, if you're going to have enough fuel or resources to get back. And there's this prospector mentality for all these pilots going out on these missions. I couldn't recommend this one enough, but it's one that's a classic. I'm sure everyone's heard of it. It won 4 major awards when it came out, but man, I'm glad I finally read that this year. I loved it so much I read the next 3 books in the Heechee saga, but this is still the best as far as I'm concerned. Okay, at number 2, The Long Tomorrow by Leigh Brackett. Now, I knew that the basic premise of this one is that the Amish inherit a post-apocalyptic world because they were better suited to live in a world that had kind of lost some of its technology and electricity and things like that. And so I was fascinated by that concept and idea. But this is really a coming-of-age story about one of our main characters. We get a lot from him and his brother as they kind of are curious about how the world used to be. They want to seek some knowledge which is kind of suppressed in this new world. And it was done so well. Leigh Brackett is an amazing author. There was a lot of things that were sort of personal for me in this one, and I couldn't recommend this one enough either. You got to check this one out. And at number 1, Rax by Michael G. Coney. This book, I can't really think of any negatives for this book. All these other books, you could pick them apart, but this one, I loved everything about it. It's a completely alien planet within an alien solar system, and Michael G. Coney mentions that he wrote these aliens like they were humans in a way. So they have kind of the same wants and needs and aspirations as any normal human would have. But they're on this planet dealing with their own culture, with the effects of the solar system and how it dictates parts of their lives. There's other alien creatures on this planet, which is kind of depicted by this big beastly looking creature holding one of our main characters here. And they are a very unique alien creature, one of my favorite in all of science fiction. And then there's also this love story thrown in that was done just perfectly in my opinion. There was politics of what's going on with our main character's parents and the society he lives in. There was all this mystery. It all came together perfectly. And like I said, there's nothing I could really fault in this book, and that's why it was my favorite book of 2024. So that was 2024. Really excited for 2025. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.